Belle Ransom never expected a routine day at Halden Company to end with her cheeks flaming and her heart pounding so fiercely. She was used to the mundane hum of phones ringing and to the constant pressure of drafting reports. It was the typical backdrop of life in the client relations department. Yet on that particular morning, her supervisor had pulled her aside, looking unusually tense. He explained that the CEO, Nick Ridger, urgently needed a set of critical documents delivered to his private penthouse at the top of the building. Normally, such tasks went to the CEO's personal assistant, but apparently time was of the essence, and Belle, known for her efficiency and reliability, seemed the best candidate. She felt an undercurrent of apprehension ripple through her. In her entire tenure at Halden & Company, she had only ever glimpsed Nick Ridger from afar, tall, impeccably dressed, and reputed to be both highly charismatic and notoriously demanding. Even in large company meetings, he exuded a formidable presence that made everyone sit a little straighter, hoping not to incur his disapproval. The thought of meeting him in the privacy of his personal suite set her nerves on edge, though she tried to keep her composure. She reminded herself that this was purely a work errand, and as long as she carried out her duty correctly, she had no reason to panic. Clutching a neat folder of documents, Belle rode the elevator up to the 60th floor, passing levels of modern, minimalist decor that were reserved for high-level executives. Each chiming stop felt like a tiny jolt to her system, and by the time she reached the final floor, her stomach was in knots. Stepping out, she found herself in a hushed corridor with smooth marble floors and tasteful lighting that illuminated walls decorated with abstract art. To her left was a set of polished double doors that she knew led into the CEO's penthouse. She hesitated, almost hoping there might be a receptionist or someone else to give her guidance. But the hallway was empty. Summoning every bit of courage she had, Belle approached the doors, tapped lightly, and waited. No answer. She knocked again, a little firmer this time, but the silence persisted. Perhaps he couldn't hear her. She swallowed down her doubts and turned the handle, figuring that if he had requested these documents so urgently, he wouldn't mind if she let herself in. The door swung open, revealing an opulent living space flooded with natural light from floor-to-ceiling windows. The city sprawled in the distance, skyscrapers glinting under the midday sun, yet Belle barely had time to admire the view. There, standing by a sleek black chaise longue, was the CEO himself, Nick Ridger, in nothing but a loosely tied towel around his hips. Her breath caught in her throat. Droplets of water clung to his well-defined chest, and his hair was slightly damp, suggesting he had just stepped out of the shower. She froze, torn between the reflex to flee and the professional instinct to deliver the documents. He glanced up, a flicker of surprise crossing his features. Then a cool, understated smile curved his lips, as if he found the entire situation more amusing than embarrassing. "You're from client relations, aren't you?" he asked, not making the slightest move to cover up more of himself. Belle's mouth went dry. She forced her gaze away from his bare torso, clearing her throat in an attempt to sound collected. "I'm Belle Ransom. My supervisor sent me with these documents you requested, Mr. Ridger. I'm very sorry for intruding. I knocked, but..." He gave a small shrug, heat still radiating from his freshly showered skin. "Don't worry about it. I needed these right away. Thank you for being so prompt." He extended a hand, and Belle fumbled with the documents, finally managing to pass him the folder. She stood there, acutely aware of how close he was, the warmth emanating from him, and the subtle scent of expensive cologne mingling with the freshness of soap. Keeping her eyes averted felt almost impossible. She willed herself to remain professional, reminding herself that he was her boss, one of the most powerful men in the entire corporation, and she was just a junior employee. He opened the folder, flipping through a few pages. The tension in the air was palpable. Belle, praying for a quick exit, forced a polite smile. "Is there anything else you need, sir? If not, I'll..." Glancing at her name badge pinned to her blouse, Nick lifted his gaze to her face. "Belle Ransom," he repeated, pronouncing it slowly, as if testing each syllable. "I don't believe we've worked together directly before." Thank you for bringing these so promptly. She could only nod, her heart still hammering in her chest. He took a moment to scan another page, his brow furrowing in concentration. As the silence stretched, she wondered if she should say something else or simply slip out. Just as she debated turning around to leave, he snapped the folder shut. "All right," he said, nodding in approval. "Looks good. I'll review it in detail later, but this should be enough to hold me over for now." Belle breathed out in relief. "Yes, sir. If that's all." He didn't move, merely regarded her with a faint, thoughtful expression. The droplets of water on his skin caught the light, each one emphasizing the sculpted lines of his chest. She fought the urge to stare, reminding herself sternly that ogling the CEO was not an advisable career move. At last, he gave a small, almost playful smile. "You can go," he said, stepping back so she could pass him. "Thank you, Belle. I'll remember your efficiency." Heat flooded her cheeks. "Of course, sir. Have a good day." She dipped her head in a polite bow, then hastened toward the door, painfully aware of his gaze following her until she disappeared into the hall. Once the doors clicked shut behind her, Belle pressed a hand to her burning face. She could still feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Of all the ways she might have expected her first direct encounter with Finnick Ridger to go, walking in on him half-naked in his penthouse suite wasn't one of them. She hurried back to her department, trying to school her expression into something neutral. Nobody seemed to notice her flustered state, at least, if they did, they were too wrapped up in their own tasks to comment. Yet Belle found it nearly impossible to focus on the endless reports in her inbox. Her mind kept replaying the mental image of the CEO's bare torso, the casual confidence in his stance, the way his voice had been measured and calm despite the bizarre circumstances. She told herself it was just an unfortunate mishap, a blip on the radar of an otherwise standard workday. But even as she tried to bury herself in spreadsheets, a nagging sense of foreboding gripped her. Something about that charged, breathless moment in his penthouse had stirred within her an unsettling mix of fascination and apprehension, feelings that she couldn't easily dismiss. And so, without realizing it, Belle Ransom had taken the first step into a world far more intense and complicated than her usual routine at Halden and Company. It was a world where the line between professional duties and personal entanglements could blur in an instant, and where one startling encounter could lead to consequences she'd never dreamed possible. Belle spent the remainder of that day trying, and failing, to focus on her usual tasks. Each time she blinked, she found herself recalling the gleam of water droplets on Finnick Ridger's chest and the composed way he'd spoken to her, barely acknowledging that he was half-dressed. No matter how many emails she typed or how many reports she proofread, she couldn't fully banish the memory from her thoughts. The more she tried to push it away, the more vividly it returned, unsettling her in ways she couldn't quite define. By early evening, most of her coworkers had trickled out, calling it a day as the office gradually dimmed to after-hours mode. Belle forced herself to stay put and finish a stack of pending client correspondence, anything to avoid replaying that morning's encounter over and over in her mind. Yet every so often, she found her gaze drifting to the big windows across the room, reflecting the city's twinkling skyline. She found an odd solace in the lights, as if their distant glow could calm the churn of her emotions. Eventually, she powered down her computer and collected her purse, glancing at the clock on her phone. If she hurried, she might catch her usual bus home. As she wound her way through the corridors, however, she was caught off guard when she nearly collided with Houston Malroy, Finnick's personal assistant. He appeared similarly preoccupied, scanning some documents clutched in his hand. "Belle," he greeted, looking up. "I was just about to track you down." Her heart skipped a beat, an irrational fear sparking inside her. Had she done something wrong? Was there a problem with the documents she delivered? Trying to keep her voice steady, she managed a quick smile. "Oh. Is something the matter?" Houston shook his head. "Nothing alarming. Mr. Ridger mentioned you brought those files up this morning, and he wanted me to thank you. He said it was urgent, and apparently you handled it promptly." I guess I'm supposed to pass along his appreciation. He paused, glancing more closely at her face. You all right? You look a bit flushed. Belle cleared her throat, relieved and yet uneasy at the memory of just how prompt that delivery had been. I'm fine, she answered, shifting her weight. Just tired. It's been a busy day. Houston didn't press the issue, though something in his eyes suggested curiosity. Right. Well, I won't keep you. Just wanted to make sure the message reached you. Have a good evening, Belle. She nodded, thanked him, and continued her path toward the elevators. Once inside, the doors slid shut, and the hum of descent wrapped her in temporary solitude. She leaned against the mirrored wall, exhaling. At least it seemed Finnick was pleased with her effort, or so Houston said. That was good news, right? She tried to see the positive side. He hadn't disciplined her for stepping into his private suite unannounced, nor had he requested any sort of formal apology. If anything, he'd been almost amused. Grateful, even. Yet the image of his cool half-smile and the soft confidence in his tone still clung to her. She didn't understand how he could appear so relaxed, so unflappable, in such an unexpected situation. Then again, maybe that was the hallmark of someone who thrived at the highest rung of the corporate ladder. Nothing, not even being caught half-naked, could fluster him. Her own reaction, on the other hand, had been anything but composed. She decided not to dwell on it too much. The conversation was done, and if all went well, she wouldn't need to interact with the CEO again, at least not up close and personal. She reached her stop, hopped off the bus, and trudged to her apartment, a modest but cozy space she rented in a quieter part of the city. After changing into lounge clothes, she reheated leftovers for dinner, hoping a simple, comforting routine might help reset her thoughts. However, as she settled on the sofa, flicking through streaming options, her phone buzzed. A text from one of her colleagues popped up, asking if the rumors were true that Finnick Ridger had specifically summoned Belle for a direct errand. She winced. Office gossip spread fast. While no one had mentioned the scandalous detail of how she'd found him, she worried someone might eventually piece the puzzle together. Determined not to add fuel to the rumor mill, she typed back a vague reply, confirming that she'd delivered documents but insisting there was nothing more to it. Her co-worker's response was full of harmless emojis, but it still left Belle feeling exposed. She didn't want to become the center of speculation. After tossing her phone aside, Belle tried to read a novel, flipping pages aimlessly before realizing she hadn't absorbed a single paragraph. It was no use, her mind kept drifting back to that charged moment in Finnick's suite. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe people walked in on their bosses in awkward situations all the time. But her gut insisted this was different. Something about the way he'd looked at her, intent, intrigued, made her skin prickle with awareness. It was more than just a casual slip. Before heading to bed, she found herself scrolling through the company's internal site, reading Finnick Ridger's profile as though it might shed new light. He was hailed as a prodigy of sorts, having taken over Holden & Company at a young age, doubling its revenue within 3 years, forging savvy partnerships in uncharted markets. Articles praised his leadership style as both inspiring and formidable, a combination that let him push boundaries others feared to approach. None of them mentioned anything about personal relationships, or how he behaved outside the boardroom. A small part of her wondered if she'd inadvertently glimpsed a side of him no one else at the office had. Sleep didn't come easily. She lay awake, staring at the shadows dancing on her ceiling, her brain conjuring up all sorts of questions. Would this incident vanish into the background of daily business? Or would it be a catalyst that drew her deeper into a world she'd never planned to enter? As the hours ticked by, exhaustion finally overcame her, but not before the realization sank in. She might have brushed shoulders, quite literally, with a part of Finnick Ridger's private life. And something deep inside her hinted that it wouldn't be the last time she found herself crossing that elusive boundary. By the time morning arrived, Belle found herself strangely eager to return to the office, despite the knots of apprehension twisting in her stomach. She told herself it was merely the desire to bury herself in tasks, to prove her competence and remind everyone, especially Finnick, that she was more than just a startled girl who'd stumbled upon him in a towel. Yet she couldn't deny that a spark of curiosity flickered alongside her anxiety, making her wonder what might happen next. That spark both thrilled and unnerved her. Holden and Company had always felt like a safe place, predictable, structured, where client calls and spreadsheets provided a welcome sense of order. Now, a single encounter threatened to upend that neat picture. She wasn't sure if she was ready for her well-organized life to slide into something more unpredictable. But she sensed, with a mix of dread and anticipation, that she might not have much choice in the matter. Belle arrived at the office the next morning determined to bury herself in work and shake off the restless energy that had plagued her the night before. She had barely settled into her desk chair when the phone at her station buzzed, making her jump. One glance at the extension number told her it was Houston Malroy calling. Her stomach sank, though she tried not to let her reaction show on her face. Taking a steady breath, she lifted the receiver and answered. As soon as she heard his clipped tone, she knew something unusual was brewing. He informed her that Finnick Ridger wanted a progress update on a batch of client proposals. Belle's supervisor was out sick, and apparently, since she had recently proven her efficiency, the CEO had decided she was the person best equipped to present the information. She felt a jolt at the idea of seeing him again so soon, especially after the images of his half-naked form had haunted her thoughts. Yet she gave a firm nod into the phone, as though the gesture would translate through the line, and assured Houston she would bring all relevant files to Finnick's office within the hour. Hanging up, she tried to compose herself. She reminded her anxious mind that this was purely professional. The morning errands, the documents, even the flustered looks from a few passing coworkers were nothing compared to the swirling uncertainty inside her own head. She opened her computer, swiftly compiling every recent update on the proposals Finnick needed, double-checking the spreadsheets for errors, and organizing her notes so there would be no fumbling once she stood before him. She refused to let any awkward memories undermine her ability to do the job. When she finally made her way to Finnick's floor, a trace of trepidation settled in her chest. The polished doors to his office stood at the end of a tastefully decorated corridor, a stark contrast to the more crowded environment where most employees worked. She lifted a hand to knock, but before she could tap, the door swung open to reveal Houston wearing a mildly exasperated expression. He cast her a quick look of relief when he recognized her, then stepped aside, letting her enter. Inside, the office itself was minimalist in design, with floor-to-ceiling windows framing the skyline beyond. Finnick Ridger sat behind a streamlined mahogany desk, scrolling through something on his tablet. He wore a crisp navy suit, perfectly tailored, the polished image of corporate authority. Despite her nerves, Belle felt a trickle of relief that he was fully dressed this time, no unexpected glimpses of bare skin to derail her focus. She also noted that while his appearance radiated power, his eyes carried a hint of tiredness, as though the unrelenting demands of leadership had weighed on him. She approached, carefully setting her folders on the desk, conscious of how quiet the room seemed. Houston lingered off to the side, shuffling a few papers, until Finnick looked up and gave a subtle nod. That was his cue to leave, apparently, because Houston slipped out without another word, shutting the door behind him. Belle's heart thumped, aware that she was now alone with the CEO, but she forced herself to maintain steady eye contact. Finnick gestured for her to take a seat. His tone was calm, almost casual, as he asked her to walk him through the proposals. She began her explanation, pointing out figures in her spreadsheets, highlighting client concerns, and outlining the timeline each project demanded. The methodical nature of it all helped her push aside any lingering awkwardness, and soon she was talking with the same collected professionalism she prided herself on. She couldn't help noticing, however, that every so often, his gaze lingered on her face rather than on the documents. It made her skin tingle with an awareness that had nothing to do with business. When she finished, he leaned back, tapping a pen against the desk. "Impressive summary," he remarked, voice level. "It's efficient, yet thorough. Well done." His eyes flicked to the array of papers she'd laid out. Your supervisor must trust you a great deal if he left these in your hands. She offered a small, polite smile, unsure whether to mention her supervisor's illness or simply nod. In the end, she murmured, he's out sick today, so I'm stepping in where I can. I'm happy to help wherever I'm needed. Finnick's lips curved in a hint of a smile that didn't entirely reach his eyes, as though he was weighing her words for deeper significance. He stood, moving around the side of the desk, and for a moment she thought he might approach her more closely. Instead, he stopped near a sleek bookshelf, scanning the titles without really focusing on any of them. That's a commendable attitude. Initiative is one of the most valuable qualities in this company. I see a lot of potential in people who aren't afraid of stepping up. She was about to thank him when she hesitated, recalling the swirl of rumors that had already started. A fleeting concern whispered in her mind, what if all of his remarks came from a place of personal interest rather than purely professional admiration? Trying to push the thought aside, she inhaled and responded with carefully measured confidence. Thank you, sir. I appreciate the opportunity. Her voice stayed steady, but inside she braced for any subtle shift that might hint at a repeat of that morning's tension. He turned back to her, expression unreadable. I'd like you to continue overseeing these proposals, at least until your supervisor returns. Keep me updated directly. Houston can coordinate times for briefings if needed, or you can email me, whatever is more efficient. Belle nodded, adrenaline humming through her veins at both the trust he was extending and the knowledge that it would mean more interactions with him. Understood, she said, hoping her tone sounded as composed as she intended. Before she could make her exit, though, Finnick flicked his gaze toward her, a question flickering behind his eyes. Belle, he said quietly, about the other day, when you delivered those documents. The words caught her off guard, and she froze, her pulse drumming in her ears. I realize it must have been uncomfortable for you, walking in like that. I just want you to know there are no hard feelings. I appreciate your discretion. Heat surged in her cheeks, but she forced herself to maintain an even expression. I appreciate that, Mr. Ridger. I'm sorry I interrupted your privacy. He gave a mild shrug, lips curving in that faint, knowing smile. You couldn't have known. Let's consider it a minor mishap and leave it at that. She wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or uneasy at the easy dismissal. Still, he'd offered an olive branch of sorts, one she suspected might smooth out the rumors swirling in the background. She dipped her head in acknowledgement, a silent agreement to let the memory fade, though privately she doubted it would vanish that easily from her own thoughts. With the conversation seemingly concluded, she gathered her files, prepared to slip out of the office. Finnick resumed his seat behind the desk, already skimming new emails on his tablet. Yet just as she reached the door, he called her name softly. Glancing over her shoulder, she caught the weight of his gaze. Thank you again, he said, voice low. Your dedication doesn't go unnoticed. Something in his tone made her throat tighten. She murmured a quick, "You're welcome," and slipped into the corridor, heartbeat racing. The door closed behind her with a near-silent click, leaving her with the whirl of complex emotions that seemed destined to follow each encounter with him. She didn't know what, exactly, she was diving into, but the current felt stronger every time she dipped her toes in. Work was supposed to be straightforward, yet everything about Finnick Ridger blurred the lines. Stepping back into the elevator, Belle let the soft hum of its descent calm her. She glanced at the reflection in the polished steel, catching the slight flush across her cheeks. The sense of stepping onto precarious ground was undeniable, yet she couldn't deny the faint current of excitement that accompanied the uncertainty. Maybe, she thought, this was how some stories started, without warning, dragging you into the deep end before you had time to take a breath. She could only hope she wouldn't lose her footing entirely. That evening, Belle had just settled back at her desk to finalize the day's tasks when her phone chimed, a short, insistent beep that made her glance up from her computer screen. She checked the notification to see a message from Houston Malroy, asking her to swing by a small conference room on the 50th floor. Nick Ridger would be there in 15 minutes to review some urgent partner updates. The note was brief, verging on cryptic, and the mention of urgency sent a slight chill of apprehension through her. She knew the office building well enough to guess which conference room Houston meant. Slinging her tablet under one arm, she navigated her way through the labyrinth of glass partitions and carpeted corridors until she found the designated space. It was a compact room compared to the grand boardrooms used for major pitches, 4 walls of frosted glass, a single oval table, and enough chairs for a small team. She stepped inside to find the lights dimmed and the air conditioned to a noticeable chill. Clearly, no one else had arrived yet. Deciding she had a few minutes to gather herself, Belle placed her tablet on the table and flicked through a digital file of the day's updates. A mild sense of déjà vu tugged at her, reminding her of the last time she'd sat across from Nick. She could still feel the controlled intensity of his gaze, the way his voice dipped when he thanked her for her discretion. She shook her head, reminding herself to stay focused on the present matter, partner updates. This was work, and nothing more, or so she kept telling herself. A soft click of the door interrupted her thoughts. Expecting Houston, she glanced up with a polite smile, only to see Nick himself entering the room, expression subdued yet purposeful. He wore a charcoal suit with a darker tie, giving him an even more formidable air. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he inclined his head in greeting. "Good timing," he said quietly, moving to the head of the table. "I was worried I'd be late." Belle's voice emerged steadier than she felt. "I came as soon as I got Houston's message. Everything all right?" For a heartbeat, he almost smiled, but the flicker in his eyes suggested tension. "That depends on how you define all right. One of our major partners flagged a sudden issue with their end of the contract. They're implying they might retract if we don't accommodate new terms. Houston's handling the scheduling of a crisis call, but I need details on any leeway we can offer, preferably without weakening our position." She nodded, absorbing the weight of the problem. "Which partner is it?" "Suncrest Media," he replied, tossing a folder onto the table. "Their CFO claims unforeseen expenses require additional concessions. The entire arrangement is in jeopardy if we don't respond quickly, and I need an overview of our best options. Houston said you have a knack for sorting through complicated terms on short notice." His words carried a subtle note of pressure, yet also genuine respect. Belle took a breath, sliding into a seat and opening the folder. "I'll do my best. Let's see what we can figure out." Nick removed his jacket, draping it over the back of a chair, then settled across from her. They spent the next half hour dissecting the contract, clauses, budget lines, potential compromises that wouldn't undermine Halden and Company's broader strategy. As they debated each angle, Belle found herself slipping into a comfortable rhythm, analyzing facts, weighing pros and cons, and occasionally offering a creative workaround. She could sense Nick's sharp mind working in tandem with hers, sometimes challenging her, sometimes backing her ideas. Each exchange felt like a delicate balancing act between logic and resourcefulness. Eventually, she motioned to one paragraph, highlighting some language that might be reinterpreted in Suncrest's favor without costing Halden and Company too much. "If we frame it like this, we give them a bit of breathing room on their overhead estimates, but keep the bulk of the original cost structure." Nick leaned closer, scanning the section she pointed to. She could practically feel his concentration. It was there in the slight furrow of his brow, in the quiet intensity of his gaze. After a moment, he tapped a finger to the screen of her tablet. "That might work," he agreed. "It's a subtle pivot, but it could be enough to placate them." They continued refining the idea, building a plan for the crisis call scheduled for the following morning. By the time they finished, the tension in the room had eased, replaced by a mutual sense of accomplishment. Belle leaned back in her chair, rubbing her neck. She was pleased, if a bit exhausted, by the last hour of mental gymnastics. Nick gathered up the printed documents, stacking them neatly. "I'll present this framework to our legal team," he said. "We can finalize the talking points by tomorrow's call." You've been extremely helpful, Belle, more than I expected for someone relatively new in her role. She felt a stir of pride, though she kept her reaction measured. Thank you. I just want to make sure we reach a workable solution. He lingered at the table, watching her with a thoughtful expression. You seem to thrive under pressure. Some people crumble when issues arise, but you rise to the challenge. It's refreshing to see. Her cheeks warmed at the compliment. I can't promise I'll always be calm, she admitted, a faint smile touching her lips, but I do my best. Something flickered in his eyes, an echo of that unspoken current she'd sensed in previous encounters. He looked like he wanted to say more, but Houston suddenly rapped on the door, stepping in with a quiet apology for interrupting. It was enough to jolt them both out of the moment. Belle quickly shut down her tablet, and Finnick shrugged into his jacket, turning to address Houston's logistical queries about the next morning's conference call. Within minutes, Belle realized there was no further reason for her to stay, so she bid them both good night, stepping out into the corridor. Walking away, she replayed the subtle shift in Finnick's demeanor, an unguarded moment when his professional facade wavered, suggesting a deeper interest or admiration. She couldn't deny a small thrill at the idea, even as she reminded herself how complicated such an entanglement could be. Once she returned to her own desk, night had settled over the city, and the office floor was nearly deserted. She saved her final notes on the project, shutting down her computer with a mix of satisfaction and apprehension. Tomorrow's crisis call was sure to be challenging, but at least she and Finnick had laid solid groundwork. Her mind wandered back to that conference room, the hush in the air, the way he leaned in to follow her reasoning, the flicker of something that felt distinctly personal behind his polished professionalism. She shook her head as she grabbed her coat, silently chastising herself for overthinking. After all, it had been a long day for both of them. Of course they were wound tight, grateful for any sign of progress. Still, she couldn't ignore the faint stirring in her chest, a whisper of intrigue, an unspoken desire to see that unguarded side of Finnick Ridger emerge again. As she rode the elevator down, the building's lights humming around her, she found herself torn between two realities, the safe, ordinary life she'd maintained for so long and the electric possibilities that seemed to buzz around every interaction with him. Perhaps, in the end, it wouldn't be her choice at all. Maybe destiny, or the unstoppable force of circumstance, was already guiding her forward, deeper into territory she'd never planned to explore. Belle arrived at the office the next morning with a peculiar mix of nerves and excitement thrumming through her. Overnight, she had rehearsed the crisis call scenario in her mind, mentally walking through talking points and possible counterarguments. She felt confident about the strategy she and Finnick had hammered out. Her only nagging doubt was how Suncrest Media's CFO would react once the proposed changes were laid out. Corporate negotiations could be as unpredictable as the weather. By the time she rode the elevator to the executive floors, she was clutching her neatly typed summary of concessions and fallback positions, determined to present herself, and by extension, Halden and Company, in the best possible light. She didn't relish the idea of dealing with powerful strangers who might be on the brink of pulling the plug, but she told herself it was a valuable learning experience. Besides, Finnick Ridger had specifically entrusted her with this. That fact alone spurred her on with a fresh dose of courage. Houston Malroy guided her into a spacious conference room where half a dozen managers and a smattering of legal advisors waited. A large screen at the head of the table displayed a video feed link ready to connect with Suncrest's representatives. The tension in the air was palpable, a reminder that a lot of money and corporate goodwill hung in the balance. Belle set her notes on the table, settling into an empty seat to the right of Finnick's usual position. The CEO arrived moments later, surveying the room with his customary calm. He wore a dark suit and carried himself with an air of unshakable confidence. Before sitting, he offered Belle a nod, small but meaningful, like a silent confirmation that they were in this together. She tried to return the gesture, but her pulse was already hammering too loudly in her ears, so she simply pressed her lips into a firm line and nodded back. An assistant signaled that Suncrest's CFO had logged into the video call. The screen flickered to life, revealing a middle-aged woman with a direct gaze and a tight-lipped smile. Standing behind her were two younger associates and another senior executive. Without much in the way of pleasantries, the negotiation began. Bell watched as Finnick initiated the discussion with disarming politeness, acknowledging their concerns while steering the conversation toward potential solutions. Each time a challenge arose, she studied the CFO's body language, her narrowed eyes, the way her mouth twisted as she mulled over the proposals. Bell quietly flipped through her notes, ready to chime in if Finnick signaled for her support. Sure enough, a few minutes into the back and forth, he mentioned the clause they had identified the previous night. He raised an eyebrow in Bell's direction, prompting her to speak up. The rest of the room's occupants, the managers, the lawyers, glanced her way, some with faint surprise. She was used to being an unseen presence in the background, now she felt their eyes on her, assessing her readiness to contribute. Clearing her throat, she explained how Holden and Company could allow Suncrest a minor financial cushion without undermining the rest of the agreement. She used direct language, quoting precise figures. The CFO's expression revealed subtle shifts, from initial skepticism to grudging interest. Bell held her nerve, projecting an air of calm determination even though her stomach threatened to twist itself in knots. When she finished, Finnick quietly picked up the thread, reinforcing her points. He had a knack for reading the room, for sensing exactly how to present a compromise as a victory for both sides. Bell realized she was witnessing a live demonstration of the traits that had launched him to the top, an almost uncanny ability to transform conflict into collaboration. The negotiations dragged on for an hour, winding through every crevice of the contract. At times, the CFO seemed ready to relent, at others, she grew prickly, hinting at conditions Bell suspected were mere posturing. Throughout it all, Finnick stayed composed, encouraging his team members to speak up when relevant. Bell found herself answering a handful of pointed questions, every line of inquiry testing the solidity of her proposed solutions. Each time, she mustered her best professional poise, recalling the brainstorming she and Finnick had done the night before. Finally, as the clock edged close to midday, both sides reached an accord that seemed to satisfy all parties. The CFO granted a small nod of acceptance, agreeing that she'd take the revised terms back to her board for final approval. When the call ended, a shared exhale swept through the conference room, people moving to close laptops or to gather their notes. Houston flashed a relieved grin. A few managers offered congratulatory remarks, praising Bell for her well-timed insights. Finnick, who had remained stoic through most of the conference, allowed a subtle smile to curve his lips. "Good work," he said, addressing the entire group yet letting his gaze linger on Bell. "We'll await Suncrest's formal confirmation, but this should keep the partnership on track." People began to file out, chatting quietly about the result. Bell was about to follow them, but Finnick gestured for her to hang back. Once they were nearly alone, save for Houston, who was tidying up the last of the conference room's materials, he turned to her with an approving nod. "I meant what I said. You handled those queries perfectly." She tried to keep her composure, though her heart still thrummed from the adrenaline. It was a team effort. "I'm just glad we could offer something acceptable." He accepted that answer with a thoughtful tilt of his head, then glanced at Houston, who had by now finished collecting stray documents. The assistant paused, looking between them as though unsure if he should leave. Finnick offered him a polite dismissal. "Thanks, Houston. That'll be all for now." Houston's eyes flicked to Bell for a moment, something curious dancing in his expression, but he simply nodded and excused himself. The door closed quietly, leaving Bell and Finnick in the hush of the emptied conference room. She suddenly became very aware of how their footsteps echoed against the floor, how the overhead lighting cast neat reflections on the glass walls. Finnick tucked a loose sheet of paper into a folder, his voice dropping to a more informal register. "Bell, you really went above and beyond. This company thrives on people who think on their feet, no small feat in a crisis negotiation." Her pulse skipped. The intensity in his tone had shifted from brisk professionalism to something warmer. "I appreciate the faith you put in me," she replied softly, trying not to let her voice waver. I'm still learning the ropes. A faint smile crossed his features, and he placed a hand on the edge of the table, leaning in slightly. Everyone in this building is learning in one way or another. Some just hide it better. You, on the other hand, are honest about your growth, and that honesty can be a strength if you channel it correctly. She opened her mouth to answer, but words failed her for a second. The sincerity, and perhaps a trace of admiration, behind his compliment made her chest tighten. The hum of the overhead lights felt louder all of a sudden, amplifying the tension. She was uncomfortably aware that, after the fiasco in his private suite and the subsequent flutters of connection, they were treading on precarious territory. Desperate to keep the conversation in safe waters, she cleared her throat. So, where do we go from here with Suncrest? I assume we'll finalize the documents. Finnick's gaze lingered on her face, as though weighing the significance of her pivot back to business. He nodded, keeping his tone measured. Yes. Our legal team will refine the language. I'll likely ask you to review a final draft before we send it. Suncrest won't want to waste time once their CFO has board approval. She nodded in return, mentally bracing herself for more interactions, more shared problem-solving sessions. A part of her was genuinely thrilled at the prospect, another part was wary of the magnetic pull that seemed to intensify each time they found themselves alone. The tension broke when his phone buzzed, the sound echoing in the stillness. He glanced at the screen and let out a soft sigh. I have back-to-back meetings this afternoon, he said, something akin to regret in his voice. We'll follow up about Suncrest tomorrow. In the meantime, take a break if you can, you've earned it. She offered him a slight smile. Thank you, sir. You too. He dipped his head in a gesture of acknowledgement, and they parted ways without further fanfare. Belle made her way out of the conference room, each step feeling curiously weighty. The swirl of relief at having closed the negotiation, the glow of Finnick's praise, and the lingering questions about the intangible current between them all melded into a single, throbbing pulse beneath her thoughts. It wasn't until she reached her desk that she realized she was clutching her notes so tightly her knuckles had whitened. Releasing a slow breath, she loosened her grip and sat down. Her inbox was brimming with emails and updates, a comforting reminder that life at Halden & Company marched on regardless of any personal undercurrents that might be swirling. She welcomed the distraction, diving into her tasks with focused determination. Yet even as she typed out responses and arranged files, she couldn't shake the memory of Finnick's subtle warmth when he'd thanked her, or the way he'd said her name with a quiet intensity. The day moved forward, meeting by meeting, email by email, but Belle was left with the distinct impression that some invisible line had been crossed, or was about to be. The question, which gnawed at her heart, was whether she had the courage or the caution to handle whatever came next. Belle entered the office the next morning feeling a peculiar restlessness in her bones, as if she'd woken up on the cusp of an unspoken shift. The events of the previous day, the successful negotiation, the subtle electricity in the conference room, continued to play on a loop in her mind. She tried to hush that loop as she rode the elevator up to her floor, rehearsing a list of tasks for the day, finalize a client brief, answer a backlog of emails, and hopefully avoid any further mental spirals about her dynamic with Finnick Ridger. The usual bustle of morning activity greeted her, co-workers comparing notes on deadlines, the hiss of the office coffee machine, and the distant hum of ringing phones. Belle greeted a few friendly faces as she made her way to her desk. Despite her attempts at composure, she sensed a distinct shift in how some of her peers looked at her, like they were curious or perhaps suspicious. Maybe it was just her heightened awareness, but one or two colleagues seemed to exchange glances as she passed, whispering behind their hands. She settled in and powered up her computer, determined to drown out any office gossip by immersing herself in her to-do list. Yet, scarcely 5 minutes in, one of her team members, a woman named Serena, sidled up to her. Serena had a reputation for collecting every rumor the office had to offer, and Belle's pulse quickened as soon as she saw that bright, inquisitive look in her coworker's eyes. "Morning," Serena sang, leaning against the partition next to Belle's desk. "Heard we secured Suncrest's continued partnership. I also heard you had a pretty big hand in that." Belle kept her expression polite. It was definitely a team effort, she said, forcing a casual shrug. I just contributed in the final negotiations. Serena's gaze flicked over Belle's shoulder, as though verifying no one else could overhear. Then she lowered her voice. Any chance you'll be telling me how you got so tight with the top brass? It's not every day the CEO personally calls on someone from client relations, especially for a crisis like that. Heat rose to Belle's cheeks, and she shook her head. I'm not tight with him, she answered, choosing her words carefully. I just did my job when my supervisor was out. Mr. Ridger trusts his employees to step up when needed. Serena arched an eyebrow, still unconvinced. Sure. Well, rumor has it you're his go-to problem solver now. That's quite a jump in profile. Don't let the rest of us slow you down, Ms. Rising Star. She winked, then pushed off the desk, gliding back to her own seat with an air of satisfaction. Belle sighed, slumping in her chair. She was grateful to be recognized for her contributions, but the flicker of insinuation in Serena's voice left a sour taste in her mouth. She clicked open her email, trying to focus on the flurry of new messages waiting for her attention, client follow-ups, meeting invitations, a company-wide memo about updated travel policies. However, every so often, the memory of Serena's inquisitive stare crept in, reminding Belle that perhaps she couldn't keep her private thoughts entirely under wraps. Around mid-morning, an unexpected email from Houston popped onto her screen. It was succinct, requesting her presence in one of the smaller, private meeting rooms on the 55th floor in an hour. No additional context. Belle's stomach fluttered. The last time Houston summoned her without explanation, she'd ended up in a high-stakes scenario with Finnick. Trying to steady her nerves, she made sure her tasks were in order and headed to the designated floor at the appointed time. Unlike the large glass-walled spaces she'd grown used to, this room was more secluded, with a single window draped in blinds. The table inside was set with 2 chairs, and a pitcher of water perched on a corner. Houston arrived moments after Belle, offering a polite nod. Thanks for coming, he said, his tone a mix of briskness and faint apologetic warmth. Mr. Ridger wants a quick debrief on a new potential client. Something about a multinational firm that might want to partner with us on a similar scale as Suncrest. Belle's heartbeat quickened. He's considering me for that, too? Houston smiled, though it didn't entirely reach his eyes. Your name did come up. You've been on a roll lately, so to speak. She tried to decide if that was a compliment or a veiled warning. Before she could respond, the door opened and Finnick stepped inside. His gaze landed on Belle with disarming directness before he turned to Houston, exchanging a few quiet words about scheduling. Belle noted the faint lines of tension around Finnick's eyes. He looked like a man juggling multiple crises at once, though he masked it well with his usual composed air. Apologies for the abrupt meeting, Finnick said, settling into one of the chairs and gesturing for Belle to sit across from him. I'm trying to consolidate tasks, especially since we're still tying up loose ends with Suncrest. Belle took her seat, forcing herself not to recall the last time they'd been alone in a smaller conference room. She quickly tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and focused on him. That's all right. I'm here to help however I can. Houston clicked a button on the small panel near the door, activating a screen that displayed a slideshow of potential new partners. Belle scanned the unfamiliar logos, bracing herself for another round of intense negotiations. Finnick launched into an overview, explaining that each company listed had shown tentative interest in Halden and Company's services. He wanted a thorough analysis of which lead might be the most lucrative to pursue. That's where you come in, he told Belle, his voice retaining that calm, measured quality she was beginning to recognize as his default. You've proven an ability to sift through legal and financial complexities quickly. We'll need that again if we're to narrow our focus. Belle nodded, scribbling notes in a small notebook she'd brought. She listened intently as Houston chimed in, elaborating on certain nuances they'd gathered from initial contact with these corporations. They discussed timelines, potential pitfalls, everything from cultural differences if they pursued overseas deals, to the political environment in certain markets. Yet as the conversation progressed, Belle couldn't ignore how her pulse leapt whenever Finnick addressed her directly, or how the subtle tension in the room seemed to spike in those moments when their eyes met. She felt caught in a silent tug of war, a swirl of professional purpose on the one side, and a deeper, less easily defined awareness on the other. It was as though her entire being was on high alert, noticing the faintest shift in his tone or the mildest flicker in his gaze. Eventually, they concluded with an assignment for Belle, to compile a preliminary report on these potential partners, highlighting key financial indicators and any red flags that might appear in contractual terms. She swallowed, acknowledging how big a task this was. Yet, part of her thrilled at the trust he was placing in her again. She promised to deliver something actionable within a few days. Houston excused himself, phone buzzing with yet another scheduling matter, leaving Belle and Finnick alone. Silence fell between them as the screen dimmed. She wondered if he would dismiss her as he often did after they covered all the main points. Instead, he angled his head slightly, regarding her with a pensive look. "You're not overwhelmed, are you?" he asked quietly, drumming his fingertips against the table's surface. "I realize this is a lot to handle in a short span, Suncrest negotiations, now the possibility of a new major partnership." Belle hesitated, a part of her wanting to confess how her mind was spinning. But she set her shoulders and willed herself to project confidence. "I won't pretend it's not challenging," she admitted, "but I appreciate the chance to learn. I'll manage, Mr. Ridger." He seemed to study her for a moment, as though searching for any hint of uncertainty. Then his expression softened in a way that felt almost personal. "I have no doubt. But if you do find yourself needing support, don't hesitate to ask. I'd prefer you come to me sooner rather than later if you sense a problem." Heat tingled at the back of her neck. The way he said "come to me" made her pulse skitter, though she tried not to show it. "Understood," she managed, her voice calm. He rose to his feet, and she did the same. For a heartbeat, they lingered near the edge of the table, an odd hush stretching between them. The city's daylight pressed through the narrow window, illuminating dust motes in the air. Belle tried to quell the tension coiling in her stomach, reminding herself of all the reasons to maintain a strict boundary. "Thank you for your time," she said, inching toward the door. "I'll get started on the research right away." "Good," he replied, stepping aside so she could pass. "Update me as soon as you have something tangible. We'll decide on next steps together." She offered a polite nod and slipped into the corridor, heart pounding so loudly that she barely noticed Houston's brief wave of goodbye. Once alone, Belle leaned against a nearby wall, inhaling slowly. She told herself that this was just a heightened sense of duty, that the swirl of emotions in her chest was the result of adrenaline and professional excitement. But she couldn't deny the truth. Each interaction with Finnick Ridger chipped away at her usual composure, stirring up feelings she wasn't entirely ready to name. When she returned to her desk, it was past lunchtime. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it, diving straight into the files Houston had emailed her during the meeting. She opened each attachment, scanning financial statements, corporate histories, and key stakeholders' bios. It was a mountain of data, but it gave her a sense of purpose, grounding her in the familiar comfort of facts and figures. Still, every now and then, her thoughts strayed, back to the memory of Finnick's steady voice, the way he'd looked at her as though she were more than just another employee. She pushed the sensation away, focusing instead on bullet points and spreadsheets. If a line had formed between them, some line she was both curious about and wary of, she intended to keep it intact. At least for now. Work came first, and she refused to let any intangible attraction derail the career path she'd fought so hard to start carving out. Yet as the day wore on, Belle wondered how long she could sustain this balancing act. Each new assignment, each conversation, each moment alone in a conference room had the potential to deepen that indescribable bond. And no matter how fiercely she tried to hold on to her professional armor, a secret part of her glowed at the thought that perhaps, in the midst of corporate deadlines and financial graphs, something far more unpredictable was unfolding, Belle spent the next few days devouring information about each prospective partner, barely pausing to breathe between reading financial reports and drafting her preliminary analyses. She often stayed in the office well after sunset, her desk illuminated by the glow of a single lamp, while the rest of the floor emptied out. The quiet hum of the air conditioning became her companion as she flicked through spreadsheets and corporate profiles, trying to pin down which leads offered real promise and which were likely dead ends. Despite her dedication, she found it impossible to ignore the undercurrent of conversation swirling among her colleagues. Rumors about her sudden prominence circulated in hushed tones. Some employees approached her outright, congratulating her on her rapid rise, while others shot sidelong glances, as though they suspected there was more to it than mere talent. Belle tried to brush it off and remain humble, insisting to anyone who asked that she was just stepping in where needed. Yet their whispers tugged at her insecurities, making her wonder if they believed she had earned her growing responsibilities fairly, or if they assumed something more inappropriate was at play with Nick Ridger. She refused to feed the gossip. Instead, she pinned her focus on research. Each day she would compile new findings into a crisp summary. Each evening she emailed it to Finnick's inbox, receiving succinct replies along the lines of "received. Thanks" or "good progress, let's discuss tomorrow." While their interactions remained mostly professional, there was an undeniable shift in the way the company's internal dynamic responded to her. Certain doors, literally and figuratively, seemed to open more readily, while other employees kept their distance, presumably waiting to see if Belle would stumble under the weight of her new role. On the fifth day of her deep dive into potential partners, Belle finally had enough data to create a solid ranking, complete with bullet points outlining pros and cons. Satisfied with her thoroughness, she printed a sleek packet and prepared to show it to Finnick. He'd requested she come by his office in the afternoon for a debrief, so she slipped the documents into a neat folder and headed toward the top floor. Her nerves tingled as she walked the hushed executive corridors. Each step brought her closer to the imposing double doors that led to Finnick's domain. The last time she was there, she remembered, had been under chaotic circumstances, urgent files, an unexpected glimpse of him half-dressed. She still felt a faint flush warming her cheeks at the memory. Steeling herself, she rapped lightly on the door. A muffled "come in" sounded, and she entered. He was seated behind his desk, tapping out something on his laptop. A single nod welcomed her, and she approached, placing the folder on the polished wood. Without a word, Finnick gestured for her to have a seat, then paused to close the laptop. For a few seconds, he merely studied her, as though assessing her mood. She tried to hold his gaze calmly, though her heart fluttered. "Belle," he said at last, leaning back in his chair, "I'm eager to see what you've put together. Houston mentioned you've been working tirelessly." She offered a small smile. "I have a preliminary ranking of the leads that seem viable, plus details on each. I prioritize them based on how closely they match our previous successes, like Suncrest, and how much risk they might pose if negotiations go south." She opened the folder and slid him the summary, watching as he perused the first few pages with keen concentration. For a while, the only sounds were the rustling of paper and the subdued hum of the city beyond the window. Then Finnick lifted his head, the faintest hint of a pleased grin touching his lips. "Thorough, indeed. You've identified factors I hadn't even considered yet, possible regulatory changes in some of these regions, for instance." He tapped a particular bullet point. "This is smart. If we aim for expansion in that market, we need to keep an eye on shifting regulations." Belle felt a spike of satisfaction at his praise. "I figured we'd better be aware before we commit resources. It's easier to plan around potential pitfalls now than to scramble later." "Precisely." His expression turned momentarily pensive, as if mentally sorting through future strategies. When he met her eyes again, something flickered there, perhaps a quiet admiration mixed with lingering curiosity. "I find it refreshing that you're not afraid of delving into the complexities most would avoid. Many people rely on standard data sets and skip the subtle red flags." Belle laced her fingers together, trying not to let the compliment go too much to her head. "I just enjoy digging deeper." It makes me feel useful, I guess. A soft laugh escaped him, almost too quiet to catch. I suspect it's more than mere usefulness. Some employees do the bare minimum. You, on the other hand, approach problems like puzzles to be solved, with diligence that borders on obsession. In the best possible sense. Her cheeks warmed. She wasn't entirely sure how to respond. Part of her was elated that he recognized her effort, another part couldn't help wondering if such discussions edged them beyond the realm of ordinary boss-subordinate dialogue. She cleared her throat and gestured to the next section of the folder. Anyway, the last part outlines which partners we might want to approach first. I think we should contact them in a structured sequence, so if the top option fails, we move to the next. He nodded, flipping through the pages once more. I agree. This is well organized. Let's finalize a plan of approach. We'll bring it to a senior staff meeting next week. She suppressed a grin, relieved that everything seemed to be going smoothly. I can draft an outline for that meeting, if you'd like. Finnick closed the folder, regarding her for a moment longer than she expected. That would be excellent. Houston will coordinate a time with you. Belle rose, interpreting the conversation as concluded. But just as she turned to go, Finnick spoke again, voice softer. Belle, I know you've been putting in long hours. Don't forget to pace yourself. Surprised, she glanced back at him. His expression conveyed a sincerity that pricked at her self-consciousness, as though he was aware of how deeply she'd been burying herself in work. I'll try, she murmured, managing a faint smile. I appreciate the concern. He hesitated, drumming his fingers lightly against the desk. Have you experienced any issues with other staff? I've noticed certain shifts in the office dynamic. People talk. Her stomach tightened slightly. Of course he'd notice. It's fine, she replied carefully. I'd be lying if I said there weren't whispers. But I'm handling it. He exhaled, a flicker of frustration crossing his features, though not directed at her. Office politics are unavoidable, unfortunately. If it becomes a problem, you tell me. She nodded, a part of her touched by his protectiveness. But she also knew it was best to maintain boundaries. I will, she said, dipping her head in acknowledgement. Thank you. A light knock at the door ended the conversation before it could veer into more personal territory. Houston entered with an apologetic glance, holding a small stack of documents that required Finnick's attention. Recognizing the signal to leave, Belle offered a polite farewell and excused herself, stepping back into the corridor with her thoughts buzzing. She wondered if the rumor mill was so obvious that even the CEO himself felt compelled to comment. It felt both reassuring and disconcerting to see him slightly protective of her reputation. Returning to her desk, she resolved to finalize the meeting outline and keep her focus squarely on the tasks at hand. Yet that evening, as she packed up to leave, she couldn't help noticing Serena watching her from across the room, a curious gleam in her eyes. Belle gave a quick nod, trying not to reveal her tension, then hurried out. She told herself it was nothing, that she wouldn't let the rumor mill break her concentration. Still, as she walked through the lobby, an unshakable notion clung to her thoughts, the sense that something deeper than professional admiration was brewing between her and Finnick Ridger, and the entire office, knowingly or unknowingly, stood as a silent witness. For now, she'd let that notion remain an undercurrent, focusing on facts and figures. But in the hush of her own heart, she admitted that beneath the surface, things were shifting in ways neither she nor Finnick seemed fully prepared for. Belle woke earlier than usual the next day, an unsettled excitement threading through her veins. She attributed it to the prospect of finalizing the new partner plan, one that she and Finnick had deemed crucial to the company's future. But a deeper part of her suspected her mood had more to do with how often she found herself in his orbit, and the near-constant murmurs around the office that hinted her role was no coincidence. She dressed in a crisp blouse and neatly pressed slacks, determined to exude confidence. Whatever the whispers or the unspoken tension, she wasn't about to shy away from her growing responsibilities. Upon reaching her department, Belle gathered her notes for the senior staff meeting. She made sure every page was in order, double-checked the bullet points she had intended to share. The meeting was set for mid-morning, which gave her enough time to rehearse how she would present the data. She refused to appear anything less than prepared. She wanted to demonstrate, both to herself and to her co-workers, that she belonged in that conference room. At 10 sharp, she stepped into the large boardroom alongside a throng of senior managers, a few legal advisors, and department leads. The long, polished table gleamed under bright overhead lights, and a wall of windows showcased the city skyline. Her heart raced a little, but she kept her expression composed. Finnick was already there, greeting attendees with a firm handshake and brief, earnest words. When he spotted Belle, he offered a simple nod, professional, yet quietly reassuring, and she took a seat near him, setting her folder and tablet in front of her. The meeting began in a flurry of updates about existing contracts, departmental budget adjustments, and various logistical concerns. Belle listened intently, waiting for the cue to discuss the new potential partnerships. At last, Finnick glanced down at his notes and cleared his throat. "Before we wrap up," he said, his voice carrying an effortless authority, "I want to address our next phase of expansion. Over the past week, Belle Ransom has been assessing prospective partner leads. I'd like her to walk us through the findings." As every gaze in the room shifted to her, Belle inhaled a calming breath. This was her moment to illustrate her worth, not just to Finnick, but to the entire executive team. She tapped her tablet, bringing up slides on the large monitor behind them. "Thank you," she began, keeping her tone steady. "We've identified a short list of potential partnerships that could mirror or exceed the scale of our Suncrest agreement. Each candidate has been evaluated on financial stability, market compatibility, and alignment with Holden and Company's strategic goals." She clicked to the next slide, detailing her ranking of the top 3 candidates, complete with bullet points outlining benefits and risks. As she spoke, she noticed a few managers trading impressed glances. Others typed notes on their laptops, nodding in acknowledgement. Finnick listened with an unwavering focus, occasionally flicking his attention to the room to gauge reactions. Belle continued without pause, addressing likely concerns before they were raised. She cited regulatory complexities in certain markets and enumerated solutions, all while maintaining that calm, sure-footed cadence she'd rehearsed. By the time she reached her concluding points, a hush of concentration hung over the group. She could practically feel them weighing her words against their own experience. The senior staff peppered her with questions, some pointed, others straightforward. She answered each one methodically, sometimes referring to deeper data stored on her tablet. In those moments when she hesitated for a breath, Finnick would subtly interject, reinforcing her logic or adding a nuanced detail. Their exchange felt smooth, almost practiced, even though it was entirely spontaneous. She realized, with a small jolt, just how seamlessly they'd started functioning as a team. At last, when the final question had been fielded, an older executive looked up from his notepad. "Well, Ms. Ransom," he remarked, "I have to say, this is thorough work. You've done a fine job uncovering potential pitfalls before we even consider reaching out." A wave of gratitude swelled in Belle, but she kept her smile professional. "Thank you. I'm aware that each partnership comes with its own risks. Better to face them fully informed than to stumble blindly." A ripple of approval moved around the table. Finnick caught her eye, offering the slightest tilt of his head in encouragement. The meeting concluded soon after, with commitments to revisit the partnership plan in the coming week. Belle gathered her materials, stepping out of the boardroom in a daze of relief and pride. She'd held her own in a room full of seasoned executives. No matter what rumors circulated, no one could deny she'd earned her place. As the group dispersed into the corridors, a few managers approached her, offering terse but genuine compliments. Belle found herself smiling back, her confidence bolstered by their acknowledgement. Still, she felt a pang of wariness. Would their acceptance of her skill override any lingering suspicions about her connection to Finnick? It remained to be seen. At that moment, Finnick sidled up beside her. You handled that beautifully, he said in a low voice, an undertone of satisfaction in his words. I doubt anyone left with unresolved questions. She felt her cheeks heat, though she forced herself to maintain composure. Thank you. It was a team effort, truly. His lips quirked in a faint smile. Before she could say more, Houston appeared, beckoning Finnick away to handle another matter. Belle nodded politely as they left, then made her way back to her desk, riding the wave of her small victory. She spent the rest of the morning fielding emails from staff who needed clarifications on her presentation. No glaring negativity emerged, and she began to believe she might have subdued some of the doubts swirling around her sudden rise. By the time mid-afternoon rolled in, Belle allowed herself a short break. She wandered into the break room to fetch a cup of tea. Just as she stirred in a spoonful of sugar, she caught Serena's reflection in the vending machine. Her co-worker stood with her arms folded, watching Belle with that same curious spark in her gaze. Congratulations on the presentation, Serena said, not unkindly. Everyone's talking about how well you handled those heavy hitters. Belle managed a cordial smile. I appreciate that. It's been a lot of work, but I'm glad it's paying off. Serena hesitated, then leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. Listen, you might hear rumors. Some people can't fathom that you rose so quickly on merit alone. They'll whisper about you and the boss. I just want you to know, there are folks in this office who respect your dedication. We see it. A flicker of gratitude and embarrassment unfurled in Belle's chest. Thank you for saying so, she replied softly. It means a lot to hear it from someone directly. Serena gave a conspiratorial shrug, almost playful. I keep my ear to the ground. I might trade in gossip, but even I can tell when someone's earned their stripes. With that, she turned to leave, tossing Belle an encouraging smile over her shoulder. Left alone, Belle sipped her tea, her mind churning. The subtle shift in Serena's attitude felt like a step toward acceptance. Perhaps, if enough people saw Belle's genuine work ethic, the chatter would simmer down. But she also couldn't deny the faint, persistent hum inside her, the knowledge that there was more to her connection with Finnick Ridger than mere professional rapport. That thought lingered when she returned to her desk, and it lingered still when she packed up to head home at the end of the day. As she stepped out into the evening air, the city's lights just beginning to flicker on, Belle felt an unspoken sense that a corner had been turned. She could do this job. She could command respect through results, not rumors. But in the quiet recesses of her heart, she wondered what would happen if another line was crossed, if professional admiration spilled into something undeniably personal. Each passing day seemed to stoke that possibility. The question was whether she dared let it happen, or if she'd continue holding it at bay, hiding behind polite smiles and factual briefings. For now, she took a calming breath, telling herself that the best she could do was keep walking forward. After all, the next challenge, the next meeting, the next project, none of it would wait while she grappled with her own tangled feelings. And maybe, just maybe, that was precisely how a secret hope could grow, quietly, until it became something neither she nor Finnick could ignore.